It's the big story that everyone's talking about coming out of last night's edition of Monday Night Raw, that being the walkout of WWE by Sasha Banks and Naomi. The WWE Women's Tag Team Champions reportedly left Monday Night Raw last night during the broadcast due to frustrations with WWE Creative. There is so much going on in this story, so I'm trying to cover all of the bases in today's WWE news. Hey guys, welcome back to Wrestling News 365. Hope everyone is doing very well. As always, there are plenty of news stories to get into in the world of WWE, and there really is, as I mentioned, only one story to talk about today, and that is the walkout from WWE by WWE Women's Tag Team Champions Sasha Banks and Naomi. It's a huge story, and it's just... things like this have happened in the past, but the way that WWE is handling this one, the public statements and the story behind the story behind the story, it's constantly evolving. There's constantly new information coming out about this one, and that's why I've really decided to leave it a few hours, because it feels like with every passing minute and hour, another version of this comes out, or more details or more information about why Sasha Banks and Naomi walked out of Monday Night Raw last night comes to light. So I've tried my best to compile everything, all of the details that we know right now. Of course, if we know more details later on, we'll talk about it here on the channel. But nevertheless, last night's Raw, if you're not familiar, last night's Raw kicked off with several new matches being announced. Now, this included a six-pack challenge to determine the number one contender for the Raw Women's Championship. Seems simple enough. The original match was supposed to see Women's Tag Team Champions Naomi and Sasha Banks versus Asuka, Becky Lynch, Doudrop, and Nikki Ash to determine the new challenger to Bianca Belair, her Raw Women's Championship. However, that match got abruptly changed early on in the show when Adam Pearce, of course the WWE official, switched it to a singles match between Becky Lynch and Asuka to determine the number one contender. Now, there wasn't really much explanation given on the show itself, but new reports now give some insight as to what is going on, and I guess the chaos that was going on backstage at Raw last night. Now, PW Insider, credit to them, they were first to report this story, but everyone's now got more details about this. PW Insider first reported that Sasha Banks apparently took issue with certain creative ideas pitched for the show. She then requested a meeting with WWE Chairman and CEO Vince McMahon, which she was granted, but when Vince wouldn't budge on his own creative vision for the match, Banks took it upon herself to leave the arena. Now, her tag team partner and fellow women's tag team champion Naomi reportedly joined Sasha Banks in exiting the building. This was especially peculiar considering that Naomi was actually booked to win the match and become the new number one contender for the Raw Women's Championship at Hell in a Cell. That comes from Sean Ross Sapp over there at Fightful. Way more when it comes to Fightful reports later on, by the way. So, of course, this isn't the first time that Vince McMahon and Sasha Banks have bumped heads as well, because, of course, Vince and Sasha Banks disagreed when it came to WrestleMania 35, when it came to Sasha Banks originally going on hiatus from the company and taking some time off. She actually requested her release at that period of time, and Vince advised her at the time, take an extended vacation. She did return. So that's what happened last night, but there is way more information about this. Now, after all of this happening, Sasha Banks actually unfollowed, if that's your currency, a bunch of WWE Twitter accounts last night, key Twitter accounts. While this may or may not be related to her walking out of Raw on Monday, it's worth pointing out that she unfollowed the handles of WWE, Vince McMahon, Bayley, interesting considering that they're best friends, Becky Lynch, the Usos, Seth Rollins, and Roman Reigns. She is currently following only 6 accounts, that being Naomi, John Cena, Tamina Snuka, her cousin Snoop Dogg, and 2 fan accounts. Again, you can look into that how you will. It was mentioned on the broadcast. This is how wild this story is. It was mentioned during the broadcast that WWE announcer Corey Graves mentioned live on Raw that Banks and Naomi, quote, summarily and unprofessionally left the arena. Now, some people are giving Corey Graves some scrutiny and criticism over this, but chances are that is a line directly fed to him by Vince McMahon in his ear whilst he was doing the graphic. So that's important to state as well. But this is where it gets even weirder. As I mentioned, people have walked out of WWE in the past. It's always a big story, whether it's Steve Austin, CM Punk, Sasha Banks in the past. But this is where it gets truly, truly bizarre. WWE released a statement late last night, early this morning, depending where you are. And the phrasing and the verbiage used in all of this is quite strange. This is what WWE have said. Quote, when Sasha Banks and Naomi arrived at the arena this afternoon, they were informed of their participation in the main event of tonight's Monday Night Raw. During the broadcast, they walked into WWE Head of Talent Relations John Laurinaitis' office with their suitcases in hand, placed their tag team championship bouts on his desk, and walked out. They claimed they weren't respected enough as tag team champions, and even though they had 8 hours to rehearse and construct their match, they claimed they were uncomfortable in the ring with two of their opponents, even though they'd had matches with those individuals in the past with no consequence. Monday Night Raw is a scripted live TV show whose characters are expected to perform the requirements of their contract. We regret we were unable to deliver as advertised tonight's main event, end quote. So first of all, let's get into that statement before I get into the Fightful Report, which completely blows this wide open. That statement rather, is, as a long time, I've been a fan of WWE and pro wrestling my entire life. Very rarely, very, very rarely do you see WWE put out a statement like that. Kayfabe, by the way, is completely dead. If it had somewhat of a pulse, it got put into the ground by WWE with that statement. That certainly was odd when they're talking about, Raw is a scripted live TV show. Man, even in 2022, that's a wild line to say. It also is funny at the end where it says, we regret we were unable to deliver as advertised tonight's main event. When have they ever regretted not delivering an advertised main event? That's what WWE does. I think that what they're saying there is most likely true. I think they're probably being slightly economical with the truth. I do believe that they walked into John Laurinaitis' office with a suitcase in hands and put the bouts on the desk and said, we're out of here. I absolutely believe that. I think that's probably how the situation worked. When it comes to them claiming that they weren't respected enough as tag team champions, I believe that. We'll talk about that in a second or so. But the interesting thing I found with this statement is when they claim that Sasha Banks and Naomi claimed that they were uncomfortable in the ring with two of their opponents. That to me sounds very much like WWE trying to, and apologies for the pun here, to control their own narrative or make sure they get their version of the events out there first. Because, of course, Sasha Banks and Naomi ain't going to come out and say anything as of right now. WWE is making sure that they're the baby faces in this situation, that they're protected. They're saying, well, they left because they felt that some of their opponents were dangerous or they weren't comfortable working with their opponents. I believe that they probably weren't comfortable working with some of their opponents because they wanted a major program with two of their opponents, that being Nikki Ash and Doudrop, a tag team championship feud. I think that's what probably they wanted. Not the fact that, we don't want to get in the ring with them because they're dangerous, they're going to hurt us, because everyone involved in that match, Becky Lynch, Asuka, Nikki Ash, Doudrop, they're all very, very professional and safe workers, and trying to imply that one of your co-workers is dangerous is a really big no-no in professional wrestling. So WWE implying that feels like a bit of a dirty move, but to be honest, you've got two situations here where leaving and walking out is never the right thing to do, but also WWE releasing this statement is just bizarre because they just don't do it. And again, pro wrestling, I know it's 2022, I know everyone knows it's a work, or most people, they should anyway, but for WWE to come out right out there and say it's a scripted live TV show, they had 8 hours to rehearse. It's wild. It's a wild, wild statement for WWE to release. But it doesn't end there. This is what's crazy about this story. So Fightful, Sean Ross Sapp, to give them their credit, they've been all over this story in the last, since it's happened, last 12, 18 hours or so. So again, you're going to have to indulge me here because this is quite long. So this is what the report says, and I won't do it verbatim because it's behind a paywall. So the main event for Raw changed last night after Sasha Banks and Naomi walked out of the show. That's what Fightful were reporting. Now, Fightful are saying from the people they've heard from that were at Raw, the tag team champions Sasha Banks and Naomi, but particularly Sasha Banks, wasn't satisfied with creative associated with her plans for the evening. Now, Sasha Banks was set to be involved in that six-pack challenge with Naomi, Asuka, Doudrop, and Nikki ASH. During the Raw broadcast, it was announced that it was changed to Asuka versus Becky Lynch and said that, quote, Sasha Banks and Naomi left the building, end quote. Now, Fightful are reporting that Sasha Banks had a meeting with Vince McMahon and voiced her displeasure about a situation and wouldn't budge on her stance. Vince McMahon was also said to be unwilling to budge too. Now, they haven't actually specifically heard that Naomi was involved in that, discussion or that disagreement. But indeed, she and Banks left before the show even started, they're saying. Some people are saying during the broadcast. WWE is saying during the broadcast. Fightful is saying it was before the show started. Now, it's worth noting that as of the time that the Raw rundowns went out, those rundowns are just, the script, if you will, for the show. They say matches, segments, producers, etc. There was no assigned producer or referee for the main event match. It was also highlighted in red, indicating that a change could be happening, and basically they were doing this on the fly. Fightful are also reporting that there were hastily produced segments to set up the change, but they were also reflected in the rundowns that were handed out before the show. By the time it was announced on WWE television, word made its way outside the company. Several people backstage at the show confirmed to Fightful and Sean Ross Sapp that indeed the tag team champions had left the building. Now, in an update, as I mentioned, this story gets even more bizarre because Naomi was actually scheduled to win that match. So some people are saying, well, if Naomi was scheduled to win, why would she walk out? It does feel like this was more driven by Sasha Banks, and certainly she was uncomfortable and unhappy or disappointed with the creative that was being pitched. As I mentioned, the WWE put out that statement, which was, again, wild. But in another update, Fightful Select continued with this reporting, saying that those that they had spoken to that worked the match and when they say worked the match, that basically means it's either Becky Lynch, Asuka, and Doudrop or Nikki ASH didn't actually work the match. So one of those two. They indicated that the match was to be constructed to not have Naomi interact with Sasha Banks or Doudrop coming into contact with Nikki ASH in the match itself. The working plan with the match was for Naomi to pin Nikki ASH, not Naomi pinning Sasha Banks, as some people have speculated. Some people were speculating the reason Sasha Banks was so frustrated is that Naomi would be pinning her, and as a tag team, why are we going up against each other and why are we going to be split up straight away? That wasn't the case. Actually, Naomi was scheduled to win the match, but she was meant to pin Nikki ASH, not Sasha Banks. Now, those close to the situation said to Fightful that Naomi and Sasha Banks didn't claim that they didn't want to work with Becky Lynch or Asuka, as I just mentioned. That was implied in WWE Statement. Those were the two women referenced. So again, those reports are saying, no, they didn't have a problem working with Becky Lynch and Asuka. Why would they? They've worked them a million times in the past. That's WWE trying to change the narrative a little bit there. Instead, Fightful is saying that Sasha Banks and Naomi were actually angling to work Nikki ASH and Doudrop at Hell in a Cell. The talent themselves hadn't heard that Sasha and Naomi considered anyone unsafe until the statement was actually released, which again implies that that part of the statement is bogus because they hadn't heard that, and WWE threw that line in there to maybe put the heat a little bit more on Sasha Banks and Naomi. WWE talent also got that same statement in their internal talent relations app too. Now, in regards to the creative pitch, the Nikki and Doudrop versus Sasha Banks and Naomi pay-per-view match was turned down, and there was a pitch to have them instead interfere in the Naomi versus Bianca Belair match on pay-per-view, but that was also turned down. Now, I think, looking into that, it's probably a case of Sasha Banks saw the creative and said, okay, why can't we change it to defending the tag team titles against Nikki ASH and Doudrop? And Vince McMahon goes, no. Instead, she goes, okay, if you don't want to go with that, why not have the Naomi versus Bianca Belair match at the pay-per-view, and maybe Nikki ASH and Doudrop can come in and cost her the match, and we can set up a tag team match for the titles, maybe at Money in the Bank. That's a stadium show. That's turned down as well. Now, Fightful are also saying that the Sasha Banks and Naomi issues largely were concerns about the direction of their tag team and the division of women's tag team wrestling as a whole in WWE. So again, we are going to get to my opinion on this, but as I mentioned, it's constant. It really is constant. So this is where, again, it gets even stranger. So according to an account called Adidas_head88, who is followed by Naomi on Twitter, and you might be saying, oh, why are you looking at random fan accounts? Well, some people are saying, and this is wild speculation, which I'm not massively a fan of, but yeah, it's worth talking about here. According to this Twitter account, which is followed by Naomi, which some people are saying implies that actually she knows this person or she has connections with this person. She might have told this person what was going on. Sasha Banks and Naomi were upset that WWE didn't value their run as women's tag team champions. This is what the thread says, and again, bear with me because this one is super long. Quote, "You are approached in February as being put in a tag team after both being promised big feuds at WrestleMania. Of course, previously it was reported that Banks would be facing Charlotte Flair at WrestleMania and Naomi would be facing Sonya Deville at WrestleMania. Of course, none of those matches happened. You bite the bullet and put everything you got into being a tag team. It works, you get over, win the titles at WrestleMania and become merch pushers. 5 weeks into your reign, you show up to a live TV ready to work and you are told you will be in the main event and you are happy. You are both then told that one will be going over from pinning the other, which of course has been debunked. You have questions why that decision was made and how it helps y'all." My American accent. "You request a meeting with your boss to discuss it. Your boss takes the meeting and everything is actually going well. He understands your concerns. The meeting ends well and the match is told to be reconstructed. For some reason, the producers get mad about it. You then ask, with one of your members going over, what happens to your titles. You are told basically that you will just be carrying the bouts. They want to use you both to help the women's champions get over. Bianca versus Naomi, Sasha versus Ronda. Neither one of you will win the solos titles and you won't defend your titles until Money in the Bank. You ask for another meeting with your boss, but this time you are being called spoiled. A producer walks away screaming. He comes back and tells both of you to fix your attitudes. You have a brief meeting amongst yourselves and decide to stand up for yourselves. You go to another boss and make it clear you just have concerns. You ask, why are we even in the match and why aren't other women in it? You ask why your titles have no stories for 2 months. Again, you are met with fix your attitudes. So after one final meeting with yourselves and asking others, you make the ultimate decision as a team. It's sad how one side is trying to create an effed up narrative. Also, it was asked, why were Nikki ASH and Doudrop in the match instead of starting their program tonight? Naomi nor Sasha talked down about being in the ring with either one. I don't know how that got flipped. Again, whether or not you believe that is actually coming from a place of information, we'll have to wait and see. Finally, Dave Meltzer has said that after walking out of Raw this week, this is the most obvious story, Sasha Banks has backstage heat. No. Really, Dave? He has backstage heat? Paint me surprised. But that's what he said on the latest edition of Wrestling Observer Radio. These feelings were passed on from people not in WWE management, but they also weren't aware of the full situation going on. Naomi's name was not mentioned, so Dave's saying it's more of a Sasha Banks thing as opposed to a Naomi thing. So it's unknown whether or not there are the same feelings towards her right now. But that's what Dave Meltzer said. Again, obviously there's probably heat because you don't walk out of the situation. Again, I know that's like 17 minutes, but that's so much going on. My opinion on it, and I'll try and keep this relatively brief here. My opinion, I'm not big on walking out. I don't think that's the right thing to do. I do think you should be able to stick up for yourselves, but ultimately you're under contract and you do what your bosses tell you to do. It's not about money. Life is not about money, but you're being paid to do the job, and if you're not happy with it, you do the job, and then after the show, certainly after the show, that's when you can say, actually, you know what, thanks but no thanks, I'm going home. You do your job there, and then you go. To walk out, that's not particularly great, but ultimately we don't know the full details. We don't. We've got a lot of he said, she said, they said, Sasha Banks this, Sasha Banks that. We ultimately don't know the full story right now, and I'm sure we will. I know some people are debating whether or not it's a work or it's a shoot, because that's pro wrestling at the end of the day. And also it's very coincidental that they had the Fox and NBC Universal up front, since Stephanie McMahon saying, we can script the final buzzer shot better than anyone else, and this, that, and the other. I believe it to be a shoot. I don't think it's a work or anything like that. If it was a work, no disrespect to either of them, but I think they would have done it with, main event level, talents. Not to say that Sasha Banks isn't or anything like that, but I can totally understand Sasha Banks' frustrations, certainly. I thought it was odd, to be honest, when she was put in the tag team with Naomi, because she's a main event level talent. She was main event in WrestleMania last year. She put over the talent in WrestleMania. She's in the Star Wars universe. She's a big star, and she's being in a tag team. And I can certainly understand her frustrations with being with the women's tag team division. Everyone has said a million times the women's tag team division in WWE is a joke. WWE doesn't care about tag team wrestling, male or female. That's obvious. They just don't. They never have. When they introduced those titles back in 2019, very quickly, after a month, they didn't care. And I think when it comes to Sasha Banks, she might be thinking, it's Groundhog Day. I wanted to leave in 2019 because I wasn't happy because I was carrying these women's tag team titles and it meant nothing. It meant absolutely nothing because the division means nothing. Fast forward 3 years, I'm in the exact same spot. I'm carrying the women's tag team titles and they mean nothing. They mean absolutely zero. People are saying that Sasha is a spoiled brat and she needs to improve her attitude, and maybe she does. As I mentioned, that's never the right way to go about things, to walk out. But it's a very complex and evolving situation, certainly. And once we get more information, I say more, there's already loads, we'll talk about it here on the channel, but it certainly is wild. It really is. Anyway, guys, let me know your thoughts on this entire situation in the comment section below. Be sure to like and subscribe to Wrestle News 365, and I'll speak for you again very, very soon.